Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at the wars of Judah and Israel as found in 2 Kings chapters 14 through 16. First of all, let's back up and see our entire outline of 1st and 2nd Kings. Remember, this is a united book, and in the first 12 chapters of 1st Kings walked us through the united kingdom of Solomon. Then we had wars of Judah and Israel in 1st Kings chapters 13 through 16. Next, there was the ministry of Elijah and the passing of the prophetic mantle from Elijah to Elisha. That was the pivotal point in the entire two-book collection. And next, we had the ministry of Elisha, and we've just completed that. And now we have the second section. Again, it's more wars of Judah and Israel. That's the section we're going to be at today, chapters 14. We're only going to get as far as chapter 16. And then finally, we will have the kingdom of Judah, where Judah is by itself. There will be no more kingdom of Israel because they'll have been taken into captivity by the Assyrians. 2 Kings 14:1. In the second year of Joash, son of Joahaz, king of Israel, Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, became king. Notice you have two different Joashes, two different kings in two different nations, and Joash is becoming king of Judah. It's easier to see it when we look at on our chart here, and you see at the bottom of the Israel chart, Jehoash. Remember that Jehoash and Joash are the same name. Sometimes you'll read Jehoash, sometimes you'll read Joash, and it's the same person. And then we're going to see Amaziah as the new king eventually in Judah. Verse 3, he did right in the sight of the Lord. Now, this is speaking of Joash, the king of Judah, of the southern kingdom. He did right in the sight of the Lord, yet not like David his father. He did according to all that Joash his father had done. So this is Amaziah now. Only the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So here he's going to be listed as one of the good kings. Not as good as could be. There's still people worshiping in the high places, but he's also trying to follow the Lord. Verse 5, now it came about as soon as the kingdom was firmly in his hand that he killed his servants who had slain the king his father. Notice that he had come to the throne via assassination. He didn't assassinate, but there were those who had murdered his father, and he was on the young side, so he waits until he's established and has everything, his power base, and now he brings justice for the murder of his father. But it is justice, and here notice, but the sons of the slayers he did not put to death. So he put to death the assassins, but not their children, according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, as the Lord commanded, saying, the fathers shall not be put to death for the sons, nor the sons be put to death for the fathers, but each shall be put to death for his own sin. If you went to anywhere else in the pagan world, and somebody committed a crime, not only would that person be punished, but oftentimes, especially if it was a crime against the crown, his entire family would be wiped out, and that's not done here. By the way, what he's quoting from is Deuteronomy 24:16, where sons are not to be put to death for the sins of the fathers. Fathers are not to be put to death for the sins of the sons. Everyone is to be put to death for their own sin. So Amaziah, he defeats the country of Edom to the south of Judah in battle. And then he goes on to, there's no nice way to say this, he picks a fight with Israel. And the battle between himself and Israel takes place at Beth Shemesh, which is in the sort of the border territory, but notice it's technically still in the part that's occupied by Judah. And at Beth Shemesh, those were the old stomping grounds of Samson, if you remember that. That's where he is defeated, so suffers a severe defeat. Verse 13, then Jehoash, king of Israel, captured Amaziah, king of Judah, the son of Jehoash, the son of Ahaziah, at Bethshemesh, and came to Jerusalem, and tore down the wall of Jerusalem from the gate of Ephraim to the corner gate 400 cubits. Now, 400 cubits, remember, a cubit is about 18 inches. So about 600 feet of the gate are actually dismantled and tore down. And a city without a gate, a city without a portion of its wall, is considered a subjugated city. Verse 14, he took all the gold and silver and all the utensils which were found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house, the hostages also, and returned to Samaria. So there's actually, we talk about the Babylonian captivity. This is the Israel captivity where portions of Judah are taken into captivity at the hands of Israel. Verse 16, so Jehoash slept with his fathers and was buried in Samaria with the kings of Israel, and Jeroboam, his son, became king in his place. And so Jehoash, we're done with him. We're still in that fourth dynasty, the dynasty that began with Jehu. And now Jeroboam, and since there's already been an earlier Jeroboam, we're going to refer to him as Jeroboam the second. The Jeroboam the first had been founder of the first dynasty. So no relationship between the two. They just happen to have the same name. And Jeroboam the second will really, in a sense, be the greatest king of that entire dynasty. Under him, Israel will achieve a greatness that she had not seen before, actually, since the divided kingdom. Chapter 14, verse 18, now the rest of the acts of Amaziah, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? They conspired against him, just as they conspired against his father, and his father had been assassinated. They conspired against him in Jerusalem, and he fled to Lachish, but they sent after him to Lachish and killed him there, and then they brought him on horses, and he was buried in Jerusalem with his fathers in the city of David. Now, so our overall outline of this section, you had Amaziah, who'd been crowned king after the assassination of his father. The assassins were punished. We saw that. Amaziah was defeated by the northern kingdom of Israel. That was the pivotal point. Now he is assassinated. So you'd had the assassins punished in verses 5 through 7. He is assassinated, and his son, Azariah, is crowned king in his place. Sort of a very brief look at the reign of Amaziah. Verse 21, all the people of Judah took Azariah, who was 16 years old, and made him king in the place of his father Amaziah. And so we have Amaziah who's gone, and now Azariah is also going to be known as Uzziah. So when you hear Azariah or Uzziah, two different names for the same person. We're going to have that happens a few times. Verse 23, in the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, now we're going to switch back to Israel, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, became king in Samaria and reigned 41 years. He's going to be one of the longest reigning kings of the northern kingdom. However, that isn't to say he's a good king. Powerful, yes. But verse 24, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel sin. And of course, they're referring to the practice of trying to worship God using golden calves, something that went all the way back to Aaron with the golden calf at Mount Sinai. And then the Jeroboam the first had set up these two places of worship for Yahweh, but they were using idols. They were using these golden calves. And all the kings have continued that practice. In fact, some of the kings had actually turned to Baal worship, but Jeroboam's not doing that, but he's still leading the nation in idolatry. Verse 25, he restored, still speaking of Jeroboam II, he restored the border of Israel from the entrance of Hamath as far as the sea of the Arabah. So notice his domain, the border of Israel, suddenly gets a lot bigger, goes far past Damascus and Aram, all the way up to Hamath on the Orontes River. And of course, the southern part was what we normally see and think of as Israel. And so under Jeroboam II, his dominion extends much, much further, going back almost, like I said, to the greatness of Solomon. We continue reading there, middle of the verse, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke, that is, God had already spoken through his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai. Now, when we think of Jonah, we normally think of the book of Jonah and his interactions with the people of Nineveh and going to that city of Assyria. But here we find out that Jonah had also given a prophecy about the borders of Israel and them being extended. We don't have that prophecy. It's referenced only here in this verse. But we're being told that even though the book of Jonah hadn't been written yet Jonah himself was prophesying. Notice the prophet who was of Gath Hepher. And so Jonah, the son of Amittai, he's the same Jonah from the book of Jonah. And yet he had prophesied these things, and now we're finding that they're being fulfilled in the days of Jeroboam II. Verse 26, for the Lord saw the affliction of Israel, which was very bitter, for there was neither bond nor free, nor was there any helper for Israel. The Lord did not say that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, but he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, the son of Joash. And so Jeroboam, even though he's not going to be a good king when it comes to worshiping the Lord has used him as his tool to bring about Israel's physical salvation, Israel's deliverance from the bondage of the surrounding nations. And so here's our outline for Jeroboam's reign. He's crowned king, verses 23 through 24. A salvation reference where he restored the border of Israel. And this was something that was promised through Jonah. We see in that same verse. We just read verse 26 where the Lord saw the affliction of Israel and did not say that he would blot out the name. So again, we have, we had the promise mentioned through Jonah, a promise with reference that he wouldn't blot out the name of Israel. Again, there's a salvation reference where he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, verse 27. And finally, the culmination of all of this is after the death of Jeroboam. And remember, he reigned 42 years. After that, Zechariah, now his son, is crowned king. And so again, on our time frame, sometimes I think it helps us to see the time frame. We have the ministry of Jonah. Presumably also somewhere in there, he travels to Nineveh. I don't know if it was the end of his life or at what point, but the ministry of Jonah and Jeroboam II at the same time. And we have some other prophets too prophesying around this time. We have Hosea and we have Amos. Indeed, Amos makes reference, Amos chapter 6, verse 4. Now, we're not going to do a study of Amos, but there's a reference there to a bed of ivory. And it's interesting that archaeologists actually found in the ruins of Samaria this bed frame, and it's made of ivory. You read about such things in the prophet, and you think, well, maybe he's just speaking figuratively. No, it's quite literal. Likewise, we have found a seal. Now, this blown up so you can see it really big. It wouldn't actually be this big. It would be actually fairly tiny, about the size of a quarter. And it's written in reverse so that when you take the seal and you push it into wet clay, it will leave the impression where you can read it properly. And translated, it says Shema, servant of Jeroboam. And it's felt like this is dating back to the days of Jeroboam II. It dates from this period. Verse 28, now all the rest of the acts of Jeroboam and all that he did and his might and how he fought and how he recovered for Israel, Damascus and Hamath, which had belonged to Judah, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? And that's a summary statement, almost like a footnote. If you want to see more, go to the book of Chronicles. Verse 29, and Jeroboam slept with his fathers, even with the kings of Israel, and Zechariah his son became king in his place. And so we have Jeroboam the second, he comes to an end, and Zechariah his son, which means we went from Jehu to his son, his grandson, great, and then great-great-grandson, and that's going to make up the fourth dynasty. Next, we come to chapter 15. And in chapter 15, we move back down to Judah. Notice we're going to Israel and then to Judah and then back to Israel. And we're going back and forth. I know it's a bit difficult to keep everything straight. We were introduced to Azariah, also known as Uzziah, the king. his coronation, and I put it in outline form here because this is sort of the same sort of outline we're seeing for each one of these kings. First his name, then his coronation date, and to give the date, it just says it's in the 27th year of Jeroboam. You'd say, well, that would really be nice if we could say it was, 755 or whatever it was BC, but they weren't using that sort of name, that sort of number. Instead, they're just saying in the 27th year of another king. We're told how old he was, 16 years old when he began to reign. He's going to reign for 52 years, a good long time for his reign. And we have mention of his mother, Jechaliah. A evaluation is given, which for the kings of Israel, all of them have been bad. None of them walked in the way that they should have walked because they all continued this policy of idol worship. But with regard to Azariah, we're told that he did right in the sight of the Lord. Now, we're also told him, just because he did right in the sight of the Lord doesn't mean he doesn't do anything wrong. We're told him that we're told us that the Lord struck him with leprosy, and that his son was therefore forced to rule as his regent. So even though he reigns 52 years, for much of that time, he's technically reigning, but not in the palace. He's a leper, not going to be able to associate with other people because that's a contagious disease, and so his son is ruling in his place. The rest of his acts are in the book of Chronicles of the Kings, and so those first 7 verses culminate with his reign. Here we go. In the 27th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Azariah, son of Amaziah, king of Judah, became king. He was 16 years old when he became king, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Jechaliah of Jerusalem. He did right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah had done. And so here we have Azariah, as we noted. His name is also Uzziah. The Lord struck the king so that he was a leper to the day of his death. Now, we're not told here why. If we want to find out why, we're going to have to go to 2 Chronicles and look it up and read of his pride and of his unauthorized entrance into the temple and how that was the cause for that. And so he lived in a separate house while Jotham, the king's son, was over the household, judging the people of the land. And so we have Azariah and Jotham. As we noted, he's going to reign alongside of him as the co-regent, and then once his father dies, he will be the king himself from 750 to 731 BC. Azariah slept with his fathers, and they buried him with his fathers in the city of David, and Jotham his son became king in his place. Verse 8, in the 38th year of Azariah, king of Judah, Zechariah, now notice we're moving from the southern kingdom back to the northern kingdom. Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam, became king over Israel and Samaria, but only for 6 months. It's going to be a very short reign. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, as his fathers had done. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel sin. And that's becoming a regular formula for us. Verse 10, then Shallum, the son of Jabesh, conspired against him and struck him before the people and killed him and reigned in his place. So not only do you have an assassination, but the assassin becomes the new king. And so Zechariah's reign comes to an end, Shallum, but we're not going to get another dynasty from Shallum. He will be a one-time king. He's going to come and then reign just for a short time. Verse 12, this is the word of the Lord which he spoke to Jehu. Notice we've just seen the end of Jehu's line. And he had spoken to Jehu. The Lord had said, your sons of the 4th generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. And so it was. And he had 4 descendants, one after the other, that all became king. But then that was it. That's all that dynasty received. Verse 13, Shallum, the son of Jabesh, became king in the 39th year of Uzziah, king of Judah, and he reigned 1 month. That's going to be a very short reign. Then Menahem, son of Gadi, went from Tisra and came to Samaria and struck Shallum, the son of Jabesh, in Samaria and killed him and became king in his place. So very quickly, we moved now to another replacement king. And so we had Shalom. Now we're coming to Menahem. Then Menahem struck Tifsha and all who were in it and its borders from Tisra, because they did not open to him. Therefore he struck it. And what we're talking about, and I'm giving you a probable location. Notice I put a question mark because we're not entirely sure. But as he struck the city, as he captured this city, this border city far to the north, notice it says he ripped up all the women who were with child. It's one thing to conquer a city. It's another thing to go a step beyond. He's acting the way that the Assyrians act. It's the sort of thing that we expect from the Assyrians. And sure enough, we're going to see the Assyrians eventually entering the story. And so he had gone as far north as Tifsa to commit this act. But now we're going to see the echoes of that act coming back against Israel. Verse 18, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart all his days from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel sin. Again, referencing that idolatry. Now we see Assyria come into the scene. Verse 19, Pul, king of Assyria, came against the land, and Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver, so that his hand might be with him to strengthen the kingdom under his rule. The Assyrians show up, and Menahem tries to buy them off, tries to pay them off with a bribe. And he's dealing with this king by the name of Pul. By the way, we're going to know Pul by a different name. We'll get to that in a minute. Tiglath-Pileser, and we're going to call him the third because there's been a few of them prior to this. Then Menahem exacted the money from Israel, even from all the mighty men of wealth, from each man 50 shekels of silver to pay the king of Assyria. They have this big income tax. So the king of Assyria returned and did not remain there in the land, and they managed to pay him off, at least for the time being. Of course, the Assyrians are going to be back. As we said, this is Tiglath-Pileser III, also known as Pul. It's thought that that term Pul actually might be an old Assyrian word for gardener. Now, I'm not sure about that. And from all accounts, Tiglath-Pileser, when he comes on the scene, he says, okay, I'm now the legitimate king, but he's not pointing to his father who had been king before him. He's originally an Assyrian general. Don't know if he'd ever been a gardener, so I'm not sure how he got that name Pul. But he took the throne of Assyria after a civil war, made himself king, established himself there, and defeated the Medes to the east of Assyria, and now is turning west, coming against places like Israel. Verse 22, and Menahem slept with his fathers, and Pekahiah, his son, became king in his place. In the 50th year of Azariah, king of Judah, Pekahiah, son of Menahem, became king over Israel in Samaria and reigned 2 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel sin. And we've said it again and again and again. That's the idolatry being referenced there. And so we had Menahem and now Pekahiah, 2 very brief reigns. Can we call this a dynasty? Well, they're not really going to reign long enough to be able to call it that. Verse 25, then Pekah, son of Remaliah, his officer, conspired against him and struck him in Samaria, so that two-person dynasty isn't going to last. Notice it struck him in Samaria in the castle of the king's house with Argob and Ariah, and with him were 50 men of the Gileadites, and he killed him and became king in his place. And so we've had another change of houses as to who's going to be ruling in Israel. And so we went from Pekahiah now to Pekah. Now he's going to last a bit longer. We're going to see him for 10 years, and he'll be king over Israel. Verse 27, chapter 15, verse 27. In the 52nd year of Azariah, king of Judah, Pekah, son of Remaliah, became king over Israel and Samaria and reigned 20 years. I'm sorry, I said 10, should have said 20. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he made Israel sin. In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, and we saw him already, king of Assyria. He's back, came and captured Ijon and Abel Beth Maacah and Janoah and Kadesh and Hatzor and Gilead and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali. You notice he's taking the entire northern quadrant of Israel, and he carried them captive to Assyria. Now, we normally talk about the Assyrian captivity. This isn't it officially, but this is actually the beginnings of that. We're seeing some of the people of Israel being carried away captive into Assyria. And so notice the cities that are referenced: Ijan, Abel Maacah, Janoah, Kadesh, Hatzor, Gilead, the area of Galilee. And from the annals of Tiglath-Pileser himself, he adds a number of other places that are also taken, going all the way down to Gaza in the south. And these areas are captured. He's on his way first to Israel. He hasn't finished taking Israel yet. He won't take all of Israel, but his successors will eventually. And then Judah, notice, is next on the map. Verse 30, and Hoshea the son of Elah made a conspiracy against Pekah the son of Remaliah, and struck him and put him to death, and became king in his place in the 20th year of Jotham the son of Uzziah. So Pekah, was he going to do a dynasty? Well, maybe he had that intention, but he does not manage to do so. And now we have Hoshea coming on the scene, and he will be our next king. Chapter 16 now, verse 1. And I know we're moving through a lot of material. Chapter 16, verse 1. In the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, Ahaz, the son of Jotham, king of Judah, became king. Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And we've almost gotten used to hearing that the kings of Judah are doing right, but that's not the case here. And he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord, his God, as his father David had done. So Ahaz is going to break the recent tradition. We've had kings that are actually doing fairly good. They're trying to worship the Lord. They're not always doing everything right. And Ahaz is breaking that mold, and he's not doing what's right in the sight of the Lord. So here we have Ahaz coming on the scene, son of Jotham, king of Judah. He's going to be king for the next 20 years, although if we count, remember that sometimes we count his co-regency with father, which makes for a longer reign. It's in his day that we have the book of Isaiah written, or at least portions of it, Isaiah's ministry. And Isaiah is actually going to talk about him and a prophecy that is given during his reign. We have not only Isaiah, but Micah as well. Notice some of the minor prophets are being written. Sometimes we read the major prophets and minor prophets and get the mistaken idea that the minor prophets come after the major prophets. No, they're at the same time. They're just shorter books that are written at the same time. Verse 3, what did he do wrong? Here it is. But he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, and even made his son pass through the fire. Now, passing through the fire, that's a human sacrifice. That's taking his son and killing one of his sons and sacrificing him to pagan gods. And even made his son pass through the fire according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had driven out from before the sons of Israel. He sacrificed and burned incense on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. He's worshiping the pagan gods in places of paganism. Verse 5, then Rezin king of Aram and Pekah son of Remaliah king of Israel came up to Jerusalem to wage war, and they besieged Ahaz, but could not overcome him. And it's in the midst of this situation that the story that takes place in Isaiah chapter 7, that takes place, where these two kings are coming up against Ahaz, and they're actually planning on killing Ahaz and replacing him with a king of their own choosing. And God gives a prophecy about how a child is going to be born, and born to a young woman. And before he's on solid food, these two kings you're worried about, who are coming down to attack you, they will be overthrown. Now, that prophecy, when it's given, it apparently is something that took place back in his day, but it has echoes because there's also a child born to a young woman, actually a child born to a virgin, because that's the way it's translated in the Greek Septuagint, that's repeated in the New Testament, that pictures not just a young woman back from the days of Ahaz, but a virgin that would conceive and give birth to one who would be the anointed one, the king. And we're speaking specifically of Jesus. So it's a prophecy that has two applications, one in that day and one when Jesus comes on the scene. Verse 6, at that time, Rezin, king of Aram, recovered Elath. And so even though they were not able to capture Judah, they did capture the city of Elath far to the south for Aram, and cleared the Judeans out of Elath entirely. And the Arameans came to Elath and have lived there to this day. And so Elath, if you go to Elath today, it's a possession of Israel. But in that day, it had become a possession of Aram. Of course, that was the port city that had the trade routes going through the Red Sea and all the way down to southern Arabia and perhaps as far away as Africa and India. Verse 7, so Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. Now, Ahaz had been given a promise by God. You trust me, and I will make sure that those two kings you're worried about will be overthrown. And instead of trusting God, he sends messengers to the Assyrian king saying, I am your servant, your son, come up and deliver me from the hand of the king of Aram and from the hand of king of Israel who are rising up against me. He's trying to enlist Assyria to come and fight on his behalf instead of trusting in God to come and fight on his behalf. And Assyria is going to come and fight on his behalf, but after a while, Assyria is going to say, well, why should I stop here? Why don't I take the country of Judah as well? Verse 8, Ahaz took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord in the treasuries of the king's house and sent a present to the king of Assyria. So he's robbing God to pay off this bribe to the Assyrians. Verse 9, so the king of Assyria listened to him, and the king of Assyria went up against Damascus and captured it and carried the people of it away into exile to Kir and put Rezin to death. And so the country of Aram, with its capital at Damascus, will no longer be a problem for the Israelites. But they have traded that problem for a much bigger problem, and that's going to be the problem of the king of Assyria. And so Ahaz, he bribes Tiglath-Pileser III to attack and destroy Damascus. Next he goes to Damascus himself, the Damascus that's been captured by the Assyrians. And while he is there, he sees this giant altar. And he says, man, that's a good-looking altar. I'd like an altar like that back in Jerusalem. And he comes back, and he has a copy of it made in Jerusalem. Now, there's already an altar there out in front of the temple. There's an altar that's supposed to be used for the Lord. And right next to it, he makes another altar for himself that's fashioned after this pagan altar. When will it end? And so here's our outline of chapter 16, verses 1 through 20. He's crowned king in verses 1 through 4. We had Rezin of Aram invading Judah. Ahaz removes the item from the temple to pay off that bribe to the king of Assyria. He copies the designs of the pagan altar that he saw in Damascus. He now removes items again from the temple for the king of Assyria. And so notice I've got items removed in verses 7 through 9. Again, I've got items removed, just a retelling of that. And then we have a statement that the rest of the acts of Ahaz are to be found in the books of Chronicles of the Kings. And finally, we come to a close with his son Hezekiah, who is crowned king. Now, let me just say that this story has looked incredibly dark for the southern kingdom of Judah until we get to Hezekiah. And unfortunately, we're going to skip a chapter before we even read about Hezekiah, because chapter 17 is going to be taken up not with Hezekiah, but with the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. But in chapter 18, we'll come back and we'll talk about Hezekiah. And he will be a breath of fresh air, because as bad as Ahaz was in turning against God, Hezekiah is going to go in completely the other direction. He's going to say, no, let's go back and turn back to God. Let's get rid of all these pagan places. Let's get rid of these pagan altars. Let's trust in the Lord.